I am. Good evening, and welcome to Beyond Loaves and Fishes. I'm Reverend Jeff Snyder, and I'm getting started a few minutes early here, making sure all the equipment is up and running, so that I can speak to you for a couple of minutes before we get started. Wanted to let you know a little bit more about this little adventure that we're doing here. This is a live stream Bible study. It's a first for me. It's new and it's evolving slowly over time. You'll see it change. But what we're trying to do here is create a little community of believers. A little community online that gets together at the end of a busy day and looks at life application studies to various books of the Bible. We're starting here with Esther. That's our first book. It's a wonderful, wonderful book of the Bible. I want, in part, to give you a sense of the richness of the library that is the Bible. It's more than just a collection of tomes. It's far more than you need to eat your vegetables, you need to study this. This is a dynamic series of books that used every means that the authors had available to them to try to express how much God loves us, how much God means to us, and is active in our lives and wants the best, very best for us. And this is all done through a long stretch of history, covering a very long period of time, people going all the way back from tribal peoples all the way up to people living an urban lifestyle. So you've got a little bit of everything going on in here. You're going to see there's a lot of material that deals with their period of time and the way they were living. Some people get surprised by this. They say, well, they're talking about a negative thing there. How is this possible in God's Word? Well, God allows people to speak for themselves. God inspired them all, but God allows them to speak in their own vernacular, to their own people, in their own ways. God didn't try to stop them from doing that. Therefore, you've got references to all sorts of things, some of which we find shocking today, like slavery, for example, or an extremely ranked patriarchal society, the execution by crucifixion, that sort of thing. Now, I want to let you know that people have been studying the Bible or the Scriptures for a very long time, and there's a whole lot of material written on it. And we're going to go through each book that we go, and we're going to focus on those books. If you have questions that don't relate to that, you'll see that I'm not going to deal with them directly right on line as we're speaking, because I'll keep reference to them, and we may come back to them in a special episode. Part of the reason for this is my background. I was an archaeologist first. That was the first thing that I did as a career, and I wrote books after that, so I do a lot of research. And I don't feel comfortable just stating something flat out that I haven't done a little work on. And if you have some interesting questions, I want to go back and do a little cross-referencing before I say something on a place like this. I want to make sure that I give you a good answer, and you can consider me a reliable source. So we'll be beginning here in a couple of minutes. I just wanted to take that time to introduce myself a little more and introduce what we're doing here. We really do want to create a community. We're hoping to grow it over time. And it's very exciting right now, and I'm delighted for the people who have been showing up regularly, and I'm looking forward to others coming along. If you would like to join us, if you're stumbling across us for the first time, hit the subscribe button here on the site, and then you'll get weekly updates on to when the next episode will be on. Tonight we're going to start with Esther again. We're going to continue with the book of Esther. We're going to give it a few more minutes here. People aren't supposed to start showing up for another minute. And once they do, we will plunge in at the cliffhanger where we left off from Esther. There's Sherry. I'm glad to see you're here. And once we get a couple more, we'll launch in where we left off. We left off at quite an interesting moment where, well, The enemy Haman has come up with a very large gallows he wants to do in Mordecai. He is not happy with Mordecai at all, and he wants him done in. And it doesn't look like the king is going to do anything to stop that. But where we left off, the king had had a very fitful night. He did not sleep well, and so he had the annals pulled out and discovered that Haman's adversary, Mordecai, the only reason Haman is really upset with him is that he doesn't feel that Mordecai is obsequious enough to him. He doesn't bow to him as Haman wishes he would, and that's enough for him to want to kill him. And not only him, but to kill all of the Jews living in Persia. It's quite the story. And we'll begin here in just a minute. I'm going to wait and see if we can get another couple people or two on here before we plunge in. So, hope you're doing well tonight. And if you listen really carefully in the background, you may hear our dog Daisy, who's a beagle. She might bark from time to time, which just lets you know that we're having an interesting home life here, and Daisy's around, and is part of that. So, we're going to give it just a couple more minutes, and then we will get started. I hope everybody's doing well this evening. Another reason for this is that we're trying to give people who work a little relief, a half an hour when they can pull aside and watch this, or people who are homebound and can't get out, give them a chance to enjoy a little Bible study too. So that's some of the reasons that we're here. We're trying to create this little community. We're looking forward to watching it grow slowly over time and getting more and more people involved. So tell your friends, and we'll all get started. Well, I'm going to give it just about 30 more seconds, and then I'm going to plunge in and people can catch up as we go along. One thing, you'll see me take a sip every now and then. I'm trying to keep this as a casual thing. But over time, see if you can keep track of how many different mugs I use over the weeks. We left off on, boy, the questions you're asking. We left off on chapter 6, Sherry? Yes, we are on chapter 6. The last thing we read was from chapter 5, verses 13 through chapter 6, verse 11. That's where we are right now. And we're about to plunge in again a little bit more. Nothing had been done for Mordecai, and the king wants to change that, as we're going to see. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're going to start with the reading. The king is speaking. The king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. So the king's servants told him, Haman is here, standing in the court." The king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What shall be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor?" Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king wish to honor more than me?" So Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king wishes to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse that the king has ridden, with a royal crown on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to the one of the king's most noble officers. Let him robe the man whom the king wishes to honor, and let him conduct the man on horseback through the open square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done for a man whom the king wishes to honor.'" Then the king said to Haman, "Quickly, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to the Jew Mordecai, who sits at the king's gate. leave out nothing that you mentioned." So Haman took the robes and the horse and robed Mordecai and led him riding through the open square of the city, proclaiming, "Thus shall it be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor." Well, it doesn't pay to make assumptions. It doesn't pay to let your ego run away with you. Haman is now suffering from emotional whiplash. He left the first feast feeling very proud of himself, very pleased with who he is and where he stood in the court. He'd gone home and bragged to his wife and to their friends. Not only had the king promoted him over all the officials and the high royal workers, but also he alone had been invited to join the king and the queen at a royal feast. Mordecai had marred those high spirits. The man who would not bow or tremble before the imposing Haman. Do we let good times get marred by tiny things, by things of little substance, things that can grow large in our minds all out of proportion and ruin things for us? Does that happen to any of us? I think this is a good example of what can happen. We've learned two things here. One, don't assume that you are the one that another person is talking about or another person wishes to honor. And two, don't let little things grow in your mind to the point that they're just destroying your day. Or as somebody said, don't allow somebody to rent space in your head for free. That's another way of saying that. So, it reminds me of kids who have treats, and each kid is eyeing the other's equal treat, trying to figure out if the other kid has something larger or better than theirs, kind of like whether or not your piece of birthday cake had one of those sugar frosting flowers on top of it or not. You could see it that way. Haman's wife was the one who had the clever plan, or so it seems. Well, the NRSV translation that I'm using translates this as a huge gallows. Others have called it a huge spike, which might be a better Greek translation. It's even more grisly image than the gallows. And so, but Haman's being presumptuous with all this business of a gallows or a spike, because only the king could order an execution. So Haman is going to need to ask about executing Mordecai. Once his oversized instrument of death has been completed. And that's not looking too good now that Mordecai has been honored by the king for saving the king's life, and Haman himself has come up with how he should be honored. So this is beginning to look a little precarious. Now, this instrument is actually so big that no one would see the dead offender at that height. It's so oversized as a deadly device to be, again, comic exaggeration. This was to make people chuckle. And the monster device would have been taller than Susa's Citadel Palace itself. So the king could not avoid seeing this monster. Haman agrees with his wife's idea. He orders the pole or the gallows to be made. And as we know, with the king's insomnia and his attempted cure via the royal records, that might be a pretty good cure for insomnia, I imagine. And he's having them read to himself, and then he leads to the discovery of Mordecai's plight, of Mordecai having been slighted, never being recognized for exposing the plot to kill the king. And we're learning that Haman in the courtyard, we have his communication gaffe and all that goes along with it. These are the kinds of things that happen to human beings. These are the kinds of things we can easily recognize one to the other. And here's another warning. Haman himself provides the king with a way of honoring his enemy. So here we have another warning that can make us smile. We need to make sure you know who you're talking about before you start providing suggestions and ideas that might just work against you. You have poetic justice being served here. The king orders Haman to be the official who officiates for Mordecai. Needless to say, that's not going to go over very well. Haman has no choice but to follow the king's commands, honoring his enemy. I imagine he did it with gritted teeth as he has to make this announcement all through town about the man who's being honored by the king. And no doubt this builds up Mordecai even larger in Haman's head as being an enemy, just somebody really awful. And so that's where we are. And we're just going to continue here. I see we don't have a lot of followers tonight, but it may be a very busy week. Hopefully the live stream is running properly and people aren't able to not get in. I think I can hear it downstairs where my wife is watching, so hopefully everything's going fine. We'll just keep going. People can watch it on the recording later if they need to catch up. So Haman scurries off home after this defeat, after he has had to honor his enemy, and he's feeling terribly shamed now. How does this make us feel? I imagine it makes us feel bemused in the way that the original hearers would have been, seeing somebody like Haman getting a little comeuppance there, seeing his plots slowly turning against him. But Haman will return for Esther's second feast, where the king for the third time will make his offer of half of the kingdom to the queen. Now remember from last time, that's not literal. He's not really offering her half of the kingdom, but he is saying that he is ready to help her out. So that's where we are with that. I'm going to look at one thing down here to make sure we haven't... No? Well, we seem to be okay. Well, we're just going to keep plunging right ahead, and hopefully this is working the way it's supposed to, and we haven't had any malfunctions. So I'm looking at one thing before we continue. Let's see. All right. I think that's about the best we can do. We're just going to keep going here. So, Haman scurries home. He's had to honor his enemy. He's returning for the feast. Now Esther makes a big request. She brings it out into the open. What's going on here? She says, I want you to spare my life and the life of my people. Until this very moment, Ahasuerus the king had no clue that his wife, the queen, Esther, was included in the ethnic group, the diaspora Jews, that he had ordered slaughtered. But Esther is careful to lay no blame on him. She knows what she's doing. She's good at this. And so she approaches this carefully. This is an expert example on how to maneuver that we might all learn from. Esther also names the real villain in all of this. You can imagine the original hearers now leaning forward very eagerly in their seats to hear what Esther has to say next, and to imagine just how that's going to look in the scene as it plays itself out. All right. I don't see any way to change that. Okay, so we continue. Okay, so in chapter 7, verses 3 through 6, it reads, "Then Queen Esther answered, 'If I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me, that is my petition, and the lives of my people, that is my request, for we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace, but no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king.' Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, 'Who is he? And where is he? Who has presumed to do this?' Esther said, 'A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman.' Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen." The truth really hurts sometimes. And there's more to come. In chapter 7, verses 7 through 10, Esther springs her trap, and she allows Haman to finish himself. This is beautifully done. It says, "The king rose from the feast in wrath and went into the palace garden, but Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that the king had determined to destroy him. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman had thrown himself on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining. And the king said, 'Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?' As the words left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance to the king, said, 'Look, the very gallows that Haman had prepared for Mordecai, whose words saved the king, stands at Haman's house, 50 cubits high.' And the king said, 'Hang him on that.' So they hanged Haman on the gallows that they had prepared for Mordecai. Then the anger of the king abated." Now we need to note that Esther says nothing. When the king comes in and sees this scene, she allows the king to assume the worst from the tableau in front of him. She could have said something. She could have explained that, no, he's pleading for his life. He wasn't trying to attack me. But no, that's not the way this goes. Imagine the hearers roaring with laughter when the king assumes that Haman has the audacity to attack Queen Esther in the king's own palace. How the mighty have now fallen. The servants' helpful mention of the gallows that Haman had built at Haman's wife's suggestion allows for Haman to swiftly meet his end there, dangling very high up off the ground. So another useful tip there is that it really pays to treat the staff well. It's much better if people appreciate you, if they like you, rather than hating you and suggesting where you might be put. So Haman meets his end. Haman has exited the scene. We're getting ready to wrap this story up. And now we come back to the offer, even half of the kingdom. In Esther 5:3, 5:6, and 7:2, King Ahasuerus offered Queen Esther half of the kingdom. Both understood that this wasn't a literal offer. Both understood that it was a generous gesture that couldn't be simply withdrawn because the requester had asked for something costly either. So this worked both ways. So Esther has maneuvered the king into a good position for Esther, and one where the king has to really have his mettle tested now. Will the king honor his word? We'll see. Sometimes kings and other officials found themselves regretting that phrase, especially when it's been given without thought. And that's a good warning for us all. There's a New Testament example of this that comes to mind, and that is the example of when Herod was drunk and thrilled by his wife's daughter's dance. He swore to her, "Whatever you ask, I will give you, even up to half of my kingdom." That's in Mark 6:23. That's a familiar turn of phrase, even up to half of my kingdom. So she asks for John the Baptist's head. Herod doesn't want John dead. He's a little spooked by John the Baptist, and he is afraid of what the people will do if he has him killed. But he has given his word, and he's unwilling to renege on that offer because it was made before guests, and it would have made him look very small if he hadn't carried it out, if he haven't lived up to that offer. So there's a life lesson for us all here. Don't make any offers that haven't been carefully thought out. That's a really good biblical admonition there, as we've now seen in this really interesting story. But Ahasuerus assigns Haman's property and his belongings to Esther and places a ring on Mordecai's finger that shows his royal authority. Royal authority that had once been Haman's, but was now Mordecai's. We have really brought Haman down. He's really come off of his pinnacle. Haman's ascension and his undoing have all happened in a few days, and this should act as a warning for us all. You don't want to get puffed up by your success. You don't want to take undue offense over the smallest of slights. You need to be a big person. You don't want to plot treachery against others, because the consequences could be personally fatal to you. What you think you're being clever in doing may come back to bite you in the end. Well, maybe not literally, but there you go. Esther knew getting Haman out of the way was not the victory, though. For the king's edict still stood against the Jews. She couldn't just get rid of this one individual, the architect of this genocide. She also had to get the edict replaced. And remember, this was an edict that was supposed to stay forever. It was supposed to never be changed. So now Esther begs the king to do something that's extremely expensive for the king's own stature. And she's in tears now, and she bows at the king's feet. She asks him to call back his edict. One has to save face, Sherry says. Yes, indeed. One who's trying to help the king save face, and she's given him these 2 big meals. She's honored him in many ways, and now she's come to the moment of truth. And the king, for all she has done, and all the planning and the thinking out, and this is where all the prayers in advance worked out well. God's guidance was with her. The king is still feeling kindly towards his queen, towards Esther. He's not going to have her banished, like he did the previous queen, Vashti. As it's explained in chapter 8:8, which reads, "You may write as you please with regard to the Jews, in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." Now, let's stop here before we see what's going to happen at the end. we have to ask ourselves, is this a blank check sort of leadership that the king is using? Is that wise? Is that a good idea? Is that a good way to lead? Could things possibly go wrong with that kind of blank check approach? Do as you please. Yeah, that might not go over so well, as we're going to see. How do you think handing over the reins of life to someone else would work for each of us in the here and now? That's something to think about as you go over this. So all is not lost. The counter edict is written. Ahasuerus the king has authorized Mordecai to word that necessary document himself. This king is always on about palming things off on other people. And again, that might not be a very wise thing to do, which would allow the Jews throughout the empire to join together on the same day, the day that the slaughter was supposed to take place, and instead defend themselves. They could now be an armed force within the Persian Empire. While the first edict had been distributed by men on foot, fast runners, as you see in chapter 3, verse 3, the new edict is sent by riders mounted on royal horses bred from mares known to be fast. That's in chapter 8, verse 10. And in chapter 8, verse 17, in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict came, there was gladness and joy amongst the Jews, a festival and a holiday. Furthermore, many of the people in the country professed to be Jews, because the fear of the Jews has fallen upon them. This often happens when you've oppressed and suppressed a group for a long time. You become afraid of them, and you become afraid of what they might do if they ever got out from under your control. In the South, the slave states lived in this fear because the slave owners realized that their slave populations outnumbered them by many times. So, surprise! Some people are always have a keen sense for the changing of the winds, and so now some of the Persians are saying, "Oh no, we're Jews too. So pass over us when you come back. Now that you're in your own." And now things get intense. But I want you to remember that there's a lot of exaggeration that goes on here. There has been throughout the book, and so chapter 9, verses 1 through 10, speak to that. And we are almost out of time here. I'm not sure I'm going to go ahead and get into that in detail. I might leave this last bit for next week because this is an important bit. And we need to discuss this a little bit. And after that, we'll be moving on into the book of Matthew. We'll probably get that started next week as well. So, I'm going to stop here. We're going to save it for next time. I thank you all for coming and for watching this later. Again, if you have enjoyed what you've been seeing, go ahead, and you're new here, go ahead and hit the subscribe button here on this platform, and that way you can be with us each and every week that we meet. I look forward to seeing you next time, and until we meet again, God go with you. All right, so have a good evening, and we will talk again next week.